the top talent in the world know that they can find a job from anywhere. So they're going to gravitate towards company that makes them successful no matter where they are. So, which tells you that the best companies of tomorrow are going to be distributed companies that make these people successful. And so that's why there's no going back to the office the same way we used to go a few years ago.
Hey everyone, I'm Chris Ronzio, founder and CEO of Trainual, and this is Organized Chaos. As always, we're taking a page from a different leader's playbook so you can put it in yours as you build your own. And you just heard from Tony Jamous. This episode's all about the future of work. Tony's the CEO and co-founder of a company called Oyster, which is a global employment platform that aims to remove the barriers of remote work and distributed hiring. Tony grew up in Lebanon, went through the Civil War, and developed this incredible worldly view where he believed that we should eliminate the bias of hiring across different countries. He did this in his last company, which he took public, and then he set out to build Oyster as a way to empower all of us to hire across country boundaries. So if you're growing a business and you've thought about tapping into this global workforce and finding people across the world to work for your business, but it just seems too daunting, the infrastructure, the taxes, the payroll, the setting up entities, the HR and compliance issues, that's why their company exists. So we get deep into remote work, which they've been for the last few years. We talk about growth while maintaining your employee wellness. They've grown from 50 to 600 people in the last couple of years. And we get into how COVID affected all of us in this remote world future that we live in. So this episode will dive deep in remote work. Enjoy it. Hey everyone, welcome to Organized Chaos. I'm your host, Chris Ronzio, and today we have with us Tony Jamous. Tony is the CEO and co-founder of a really cool company called Oyster, and he's going to tell us more about that today. Tony, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Chris. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me here.
Thanks for coming. So you're tuning in today from the beautiful island of Cyprus. Is that right?
That's exactly. I moved here a year ago, and which is a benefit of working from anywhere, right? So I can build a company being where I want to be.
Yeah, and I'm sure a lot of us have that story. I'm actually up in the mountains right now, about 2 hours from our headquarters, so not quite as far from the office, but it's nice, it's flexible that you can sort of work from anywhere these days. And I know that's a big part of what your company does. So we're going to get into all of that, but I want to start with kind of the root of the problem. From what I've read, a lot of what inspired you to start Oyster was trying to tackle this global inequality in the workforce. And I think something people don't think about often is if you're forcing everyone to go to one location, the people around the world don't have the same opportunity to get employment at that company. So can you talk a little bit about that problem and when you noticed it?
Yeah, I noticed this problem when I was the CEO of and founder of a previous technology company called Nexmo. That was an API business that grew rapidly, went public in less than 7 years by merging with another company on the NASDAQ. But what we did in that business, we had to hire people in 45 countries. And I was able to witness there the power of distributed work. Not only you can access a global talent pool and build a very diverse workforce, but you can also be the best employer for certain employees in certain countries. We would be the best employer for Diego in Argentina and Mary in Athens, Mohammed in Morocco. So when I left this company, when I exited that business, it was really important for me that I build a business that is mission driven. But is also, I wanted to build a distributed company because of founding these superpowers of distributed teams. But I wasn't looking forward to the challenge we faced there. We had to set up entities, hire lawyer, accountant, payroll provider. We spent millions of dollars building our own internal employment infrastructure, and we failed to deliver a great employee experience. So when I wanted to start a new business, I wanted to be distributed. I didn't find solutions for that. I realized that if you use software to reduce the barrier of global employment, essentially you take this 180 countries, every country is different. and you use software to reduce that complexity and reduce the barrier to global employment, you can not only build a new category and lead it, but also you can change people's life. And just to give you some data points, according to BCG, there are over 90 million jobs going unfulfilled in the West, mostly knowledge work. And at the same time, you have 1.5 billion knowledge workers coming into the workforce in the next 10 years, mostly in emerging economies. So if you remove the barriers for companies to tap into the global talent pool, and also for people around the world to have the world as their oyster when they're looking for a job, well, you can reduce things like brain drain, wealth inequality. You can improve communities in these countries.
I love that you dropped that "world is our oyster" comment, which gets right to where the name came from, Oyster. So can you tell us just directly, how does Oyster solve this problem? What does Oyster do for companies?
Yeah, so Oyster, we provide a global employment platform. Essentially, it is a combination of an employment infrastructure in 180 countries. So we are the employer of record in all these countries. We have entities, physical entities, and then on top of that, we have a knowledge layer with essentially all the employment laws, labor's payroll regulation, HR best practices, and then on top of that, there's a software layer that enable you as an employer to, with few clicks, to employ Mary in Athens in less than 6 hours and extend to her a fair and a safe and delightful employment experience. What used to take months, and you have to hire lawyers, accountants, benefit providers, payroll providers, country by country, is now is essentially a few hours of work, and the fee becomes a variable. You move fixed costs and you turn it into a variable cost.
Yeah, it's such an important service. And I love that the idea for this business came out of the struggles of your last business. And even though that company was very successful, the problem you dealt with in setting up this infrastructure that took millions of dollars to set up was the nucleus, the idea for the new business. And I hear so many entrepreneurs come on and say this same kind of story. And so for anyone that's listening, if you've got a business that you're running right now, it's likely that the problems that you're dealing with every day could become your next business. So pay attention to those problems. I'm curious, Tony, the future of this global workforce with 1.5 billion people coming into the market, do you think 10 years from now, it's just going to be so normal that everyone has employees across many countries? Or how do you see it changing?
I don't see any version of the future that doesn't include that. So because the trends are so big, you have Brian Kaplan, who's the economist from George Mason University. He argued in his book Open Borders that if you remove the concept of borders from talent mobility, you can triple the world GDP. So when you have such a huge potential in creating opportunity for millions of people around the world, that's going to happen, and obviously no like short-term financial crisis will derail this mega trends that are shaping the world. Why today you have everybody has internet, increasingly, and increasingly high speed, high quality internet. Everybody can learn online. Can get into the best universities through online classes. It's gone the days where the best software developer in Nigeria works for a local bank and stay there for 20 years and lose their potential of growth. Now these engineers, 50% of employees under management on the Oyster platform are R&D. So we're witnessing the creation of this like independent nation of global remote employees that are not tied to any country, and they can dictate a much higher salary than if they work for local companies, and they are also growing with the opportunity because when they work for companies in the West that are in short of talent, these companies are investing in their people. They're investing in growing their human capital, but not domestic local companies in emerging economies yet, because the talent is so abundant in these countries.
So Everyone listening, pay attention to this trend because, this is something I've seen over the last couple decades of people that are pioneering, trying to figure this out on their own. I sit on the board actually of a company that has employees in 11 different countries, and they started 8 years ago and had to set up a lot of this infrastructure on their own. Today, it's so much easier when you use a company like Oyster to be able to connect and employ those people and tap into that global workforce. So if you're not looking around the world for your talent, you should be, I think, is a message I want people to hear from this podcast. So Tony, I know that your story you've shared in the past had a piece of it. You grew up in Lebanon, right, during the Civil War. And I'm curious how much of that experience influenced what you're doing today. How has that stuck with you?
Yeah, I think it's really hard to assess as a child. I was from age 0 to age 10 in a civil war. It's really hard to assess how this impacted me today. But clearly, I mean, there is when you have children that go through this type of experience, they develop essentially a form of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, that makes them hypervigilant. And unfortunately, being hypervigilant, or fortunately, I don't know how we look at it, is great skills of being a CEO, right, an entrepreneur, because then your mind is always at the lookout of potential risks, and entrepreneurship is not only about taking risks; it's about also taking calculated risks, and it's about mitigating risks. So your mind becomes very alert to these potential risk in your business. Now the downside of that is that you have to really take care of yourself, right? You have to find the balance in your life, because if you're always hyper vigilant, essentially you put somebody with PTSD in a CEO job, it can really turn badly if you don't have really good discipline in terms of work-life balance and ability to monitor your thoughts and not be reactive to your thoughts. Actually, I burned out in my last job as a CEO, and I'm committed not to burn out this time around.
Do you have any recommendations on what you're doing to not burn out, or people that are feeling that same kind of stress and being overworked? What should they do to get on top of that?
So number one is really reduce your reactivity to the events around you, and that's happened through a number of meditation techniques. You essentially want to observe your thought process and observe yourself, increase your self-awareness, and increasingly be less reactive to the events that are happening around you. And secondly is also you want to protect yourself from your work in a way that you want to create boundaries. You want to create clear boundaries. So, for instance, in my case, at Oyster, we don't have meetings on Friday. We don't have internal meetings on Friday. So we call it Focus Friday. And what we do is we use that opportunity to clear up our inboxes, read what we have to read, all the training we have to go through, and then make sure that we go into the weekend without the need to work, so that we have this gap in the weekend where we don't work. Another example is adjusting the schedule of my life that works for me. So, for instance, I don't work in the morning. I'm in Cyprus. Most of my team is in Europe or in the US. So I don't work in the morning. In the morning, I spend time with my children, spend time for myself, and I work in the afternoon and evening. And I introduce frequent breaks, and I have 1 hour break in the middle of afternoon when I spend time with my children when they come back from school. So this is how I maintain some sort of balance, but it's not, it's always changing, right? So there are phases where I can get off balance. In Q1, we were in fundraising, and it was a highly intense fundraising because of what's happening right now in the market. So it really pushed my balance. So now I'm in the process of getting back to that balance.
Yeah. Sometimes for entrepreneurs, you've got to think about balance through a more macro lens, right? Sometimes balance is seasonal through the year, that there's busy parts of the year and then there's lighter parts of the year. That's part of me spending the summer up here in the mountains is because my kids are off school and I want the flexibility to have more time with them. So I love that you do the Focus Fridays. I think that's a great takeaway, an easy thing that everybody could implement. So thank you for that. And you also mentioned being less reactive and trying to be less reactive. Now, one of the biggest things, of course, that's happened to all of us in the last few years was COVID-19. And you started Oyster just before COVID-19 hit the world. So I'm curious how you were reactive to that, or how did you navigate that, and what impact did it have on the business?
Yeah, we started the business in January 2020, and we raised money in February. When the money hit the bank account, we all went into lockdown, and we realized that what we thought was going to take us millions of dollars to evangelize the world, convince the world that distributed work is better for business, better for people, and better for the planet, has happened as remote work becomes a norm. And so we shifted our attention to really acceleration of the infrastructure built up, the acceleration of our product roadmap, and scaling the organization. And we, in less than 2 years, we've built a 650 people organization distributed in 70 countries that is as diverse as planet Earth. So we have 60% women in the company, including gender equality on the leadership team. And we are receiving over 13,000 job applicant a month. These are people who want to work for Oyster, and we're very, very proud of essentially building an employer brand that people want to associate with. People want to work for companies that give them the flexibility and the freedom of where they want to work, but also empower them and enable them to be successful no matter what they are.
That's incredible. I love as diverse as planet Earth. I've heard people talk about, wanting to be as diverse as their customer base or as diverse as their local geography. And I think being as diverse as the planet is something that someday, hopefully, we can all aspire to. So kudos to you on building with such intentionality from the beginning.
Yeah, well, and diversity when it comes to human diversity, we can't compete with natural world diversity. That's for sure.
Yeah. So I know there's a lot of stigmas about hiring internationally. And I saw one of your LinkedIn posts about this, where you talked about people, how they cite, regional cultural challenges or language challenges or ethics or productivity. And so what do you say to that? How do you refute those comments?
Well, we all have biases for things that we all have biases. That's number one. It's part of human nature. And secondly, we all are afraid of the unknown. So we haven't done it yet. We are proving with my previous company, but also Oyster, that you can build an amazing organization by building a distributed workforce around the world. So when it comes to culture, company culture becomes more important. If you have a strong company culture, it becomes more important than local cultural differences. So that's number one. You have to really invest in a strong company culture. When it comes to language, increasingly as the world moves into remote work, a lot of the work happens asynchronously. So essentially, written language becomes more important than spoken language for the majority of the employees in the organization. So that's kind of how you overcome the language challenges, really by investing in tools to enable your employees to be successful no matter where they are, and move to increasingly asynchronous way of working that enable people to work across time zones effectively and have access to the data that they want to have access to be effective. When it comes to the ethical aspect of things, things like also security and safety. I mean, there has been from an ethical standpoint, your company culture is more important than the local culture, right? So you have to really accept that you can find criminals in every country, right? I mean, they exist in every country, and so at various degrees, obviously, but they exist in every country. And really, it's the company culture that you build around trust, around transparency, that will enable you to address that issue. And when it comes to security, I mean, today there's so many tools. I mean, the security stacks of remote workers have matured rapidly in the last 5 years. So there's increasingly less security around that.
So Oyster runs, as remote or more remote than anyone. So I'm curious, what tools or things have you invested in, innovation-wise, best practice-wise, to really enable the async collaboration?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we call them the tools and the rules, and we even gave them a brand recently, which is Follow the Sun. So we have our own way. We've developed our own way of working together across time zones that makes everybody successful, and we call it Follow the Sun. And it's actually a number of tools and then rules in how you use them. So tools would be, let's say, we use Slack for asynchronous messaging communication. We use Zoom for synchronous video. We use Loom for asynchronous video. In terms of documentation, our internal documentation is taken as seriously as our external documentation to our customers and our employee under management. So we use in every type of meeting we have, we have to come prepared with some asynchronous material that need to be consumed ahead of time. So these are examples of the tools and the rules we use here. And we also train a lot our team. So we have the Oyster Academy, that is a remote work training that takes any knowledge worker and make them a better remote worker, leveraging the way we do things at Oyster. And it's deployed internally, but it's also a free course. Everybody can go and improve their remote work skills. And we model the way as well. So essentially, the leaders, the higher you are in the organization, the more you're expected to be a better remote worker, right? So I'm supposed to be the best remote worker of this company in order for us to model the way and for it to work. And it's really exciting. It's really exciting to be able to change. I mean, it's harder for people of my age to change, but it's like really exciting to actually be seeing this change as completely aligned with the success of my company, and kind of you overcome this fear of change essentially, and you have to do it.
I've never heard that as a CEO responsibility, to be the best remote worker. And so, it really gets at if that is your culture and that is the expectation of everyone, you have to model that behavior. And so the tools and the rules are a cool way to communicate that. One thing I worry or think about with employing people internationally is, how do we handle compensation? In the US, when we're hiring employees and trying to create fair pay scales to pay people for salaries, how do we think about that in international markets?
It's a big challenge for many organizations. The major challenge is really the accuracy and the availability of data to be able to know what fair compensation look like for a specific role, for a specific seniority in a specific country. And there's also various cost of living consideration, and so there's challenges around that. The other challenge is also you have to have a mature compensation model and philosophy in your company in terms of banding levels, the different bands that you want to allocate to your team, and how they progress across these bands, and have really clear rules around what is the compensation for a specific role in a specific geography. And that's what we do at Oyster. We have a compensation philosophy that is based on data that we use to create, to predict and be very transparent about how a person in a given geography at a given role and experience will get paid. So that's from a salary standpoint, but also from an equity standpoint, we adopt geo-agnostic equity. So the amount of equity you have is independent from the location you're in, because we believe that there is no reason why the upside should be geo localized, unlike the cost of living consideration, which is very specific to a given country.
Interesting. So So you geolocalize the salaries, but don't geolocalize the equity component because they're essentially doing the same work as someone else, and why not have the same upside?
That's correct. That's correct from an equity standpoint. From a monetary composition standpoint, unfortunately, the world is not completely equal from that standpoint, and the reality of businesses make it that you cannot run a successful business today. I mean, there's exceptions. If you're a small organization, or if you're only hiring engineers that are already very expensive pretty much everywhere, then you can permit yourself to do that. But it conflicts of reality of growing a successful business today. However, I do believe what's going to happen, and part of our job is to facilitate that, is to make sure that the supply of labor from a lot of the outside tier one cities, essentially you can think about anywhere outside these tier one cities, will this disparity will drop because you're going to have essentially an equilibrium that's going to happen in the market. The more people can be effective working from anywhere, the more you're going to see an equilibrium. And we've seen that happening in the engineering, right? So engineers today, there's a much smaller gap. Think about it as a Gini coefficient. Gini coefficient is actually, it's an economical indicator that measure disparity between two variables. So think about it: the wages of executives or employees in a developed country would be much higher for the same job than in a developing country. That curve has narrowed down when it comes to engineering. That Gini coefficient has narrowed down in the last few years because the talent shortage. So companies in the rich world had to go and find talent in emerging economies. So we see that also to continue to happen in other functions as well. So over time, you have this country, let's say independent country called global employers or global employees that can be hired by any country. And eventually that would drive down these disparities in the world.
Yeah, we've seen this domestically. We used to, prior to COVID, hire mostly where we're located in Arizona, and after COVID, people are hiring all over the U.S. at least, and so we've seen the local salaries become inflated because there's a lot of people that are getting offers from companies in other markets. And so I imagine it's even more pronounced. I used to have people in the Czech Republic that I worked with, and now we have people in Ukraine. And again, I'm, as you mentioned, seeing the inflation as there's more demand for talent in those international markets. And so I think we'll continue to see it level out a little bit. The disparity will close, but I think it will definitely be more pronounced internationally than it has even been domestically. So it's something to follow closely.
Yeah.
So being a remote company, have there been any pitfalls? Have you run into any problems? I'm curious, any issues that you've had to correct over the last few years?
Many, many issues. What we do is very complex. I mean, if you think about it, we are combining employment compliance knowledge with payroll and payments and FX in 180 countries, with benefits across all these countries. So essentially, solving that with software is complex, and we cannot solve it for software right away. We cannot just come and just build software and before we start to learn. We had to kind of learn about the differences between all these countries, and then build software after we gathered all this knowledge and databases about the different flavors of employment around the world. And there's always issues. There's always issues that pops up. Think about things like a different payroll regulation in every country. Like some countries you have to pay them 13 months or 14 months. Other countries you have to pay weekly. So essentially, there's a number of challenges that happens as you start automating and softwareizing the employment value chain across all these countries. So yeah, that's kind of really the major challenge, the monster challenge that we are tackling with software today. And so the other challenge that I faced as a CEO is essentially how do you balance growth with customer satisfaction and your team well-being and engagement as you are hyper growing. So we've grown 20x last year. We've grown from uh, 50 people to 600 people, and when you do that in such a short period of time, well, you have to really keep balancing these three variables. Think about it as a golden triangle of growth, and every quarter you want to invest in expanding the surface area of that triangle. So you cannot grow too fast if you haven't invested in your people. You cannot grow too fast if you haven't invested in your customer satisfaction. And the same, you cannot invest too much and hire too much people ahead of your growth. So you have to really keep balancing that equation all the time. And essentially, you have to put efficiency at the center. So you have to really grow the three variables in an efficient way. And many companies, especially when capital was readily available for a technology company, that efficiency variable was not always in the equation.
I'm smiling because it's like you were just in the meeting that I was in before we jumped on this call, because we were talking about the balance of growth and employee wellness. And so I think that's in the forefront of a lot of our minds, especially companies that are growing quickly or have the opportunity to grow quickly, because you don't want to burn your people out, right? You don't want to grow at all costs. And so I think how you mentioned about just expanding the surface area is a really great way to think about it. I've got a couple more questions here that we'll touch on before we wrap up. So a lot of CEOs are demanding people come back into the office, and they're resisting the idea of distributed work. I'm curious, what do you think is so hard for them to wrap their head around, or why are some companies just not getting this?
Leaders have a challenge with this because we used to confuse performance with presence. We used to go to the office and see people in the office and say, yes, people are working, then I can actually relax. And which, by the way, we inherited that from the Industrial Revolution and from being in a factory. When you go in business schools, if you went to business schools, then you learn the management techniques that we learn today in business schools are being inherited from the industrial era and haven't been much updated. So you have that fear that if people are not present in their seat, then they're not productive. And when you start losing that signal that they're not in their seat, so what happens with the leader? They start mistrust. They start mistrusting the person, their employees, and their employees feel that, and then it becomes a cycle. So you have more mistrust and less engagement, more mistrust and less engagement. So you have this vicious cycle of mistrust and disengagement that happens. So that's the problem that many leaders are faced with today. So what you need to really change your chip. You need to look at the data. The data show you that first, vast majority of people, they want flexible work. They want that freedom to work from anywhere. And you know what? The top talent in the world know that they can find a job from anywhere. So they're going to gravitate towards company that makes them successful no matter where they are. So which tells you that the best companies of tomorrow are going to be distributed companies that make these people successful. And so that's why there's no going back to the office the same way we used to go a few years ago.
So what about on the employee side? If there is this cycle of mistrust and poor engagement, how do employers look for an individual that will be successful in a remote environment? Are there things that they should look for on people that are great async collaborators or can operate across time zones?
The barrier to qualify to work remotely are very low. We talked earlier about written language because your work is mostly asynchronous, right? Depending on your level. So anybody, any knowledge worker today can perform their job remotely, but that requires that the company can make them successful, that the way the company is run and built and the way people work together is a way that makes people successful no matter what they are. So not because you need to come, not because you come to the office that you get promoted, not because you come to the office that you get more productive. So how can you create more equality regardless of the location and more inclusiveness of location? So that's what really it's everybody can qualify for being a remote worker.
So many remote workers out there. As you heard at the beginning, 1.5 billion workers coming into the workforce in emerging markets. And Tony's company, thankfully, is providing a great solution for you to be able to tap into that workforce. So like Tony said, don't confuse performance with presence. I love that. I think people should be embracing remote work. And Tony, thank you for giving so many great tips on how you've built this with Oyster and how you've enabled so many other businesses. Be sure to look up Tony, look up Oyster. They put out great content. Check out their website. Tony, thank you so much for being here. Hey, thanks for listening to Organized Chaos. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, or share it with anyone in your network that you think could benefit from this information. For episode show notes, podcast recaps, and tons of other small business news and inspiration, check out the manual. That's trainual.com/manual.